This is Garrison Hayes, and from what I can tell, he has an amazing YouTube video. But I want to talk about his opinion on why black people are still Christian. Now, I did a video on someone who is Christian, and I challenged that. I have no hatred towards people who are Christian. And now I'm going to react to someone who's an atheist. I have no hatred towards people who are atheist. But I will be challenging his points. The only argument that's really good against Christianity is if it's real, prove it. Every other argument is pointless. But let's see what he has to say.
One of the first slave ships that brought black people to the New World was named Jesus. White Christians used Bible verses and Bible stories to justify slavery. There was a time when white Christians wouldn't baptize black people because they weren't sure if it was okay to enslave Christians. They quickly changed their theology, baptized their black slaves, and forthrightly sent them back to the fields to work. 4, both black and white prosperity preachers have scammed millions of dollars from faithful black parishioners living in American slums. 5, it is an undeniable fact that Christianity has been a tool of oppression for black people all throughout the world. And yet today, Black Americans identify as Christians at a staggering 79%, higher than any other group in this country. So the question is, why are black people still Christians?
So let's address these points one by one. Starting with the slave ship was called Jesus. Okay, but if the slave ship was called sugar, does that mean that black people should stop consuming sugar? The fact that bad people use good things for maniacal reasons does not mean that good people should abandon things that they perceive as good. The second point was white people used Christianity to justify slavery. Well, this will shock you, but Christianity is not a white religion. It's an international religion. And people in Ethiopia had the religion as well, and they didn't use it to justify slavery. In fact, it was one of the religions that were used to oppose slavery all over Africa, from the Kingdom of Congo, Ethiopia, Central Africa, Sudan. Several places in the world and in Africa saw it as a form of strength. What am I trying to say? Well, what I'm trying to say is that this anti-Western take is a Western take, and it highlights the supremacy of Western Christianity over any other. Abandoning Christianity is not just abandoning Western Christianity, you will be abandoning the Ethiopian Christians who have never taken slaves, even if they were Christian. The next claim is that people in the past didn't want to baptize the black slaves because they were going to take them to the field, and then they didn't want to enslave Christians and stuff like that. But here's the problem with that claim. The way he framed it was they didn't want to baptize black people. They did baptize black people. Europeans baptized black people all over Africa. The problem was a moral quandary of, is it okay to enslave Christians? Now, again, I will say it. Those people were horrible people, the people in the West at the time. But that has nothing to do with Christianity. Christianity is very different. This is putting Christianity on the same level as the Western world. This is what people in the West do when they say Christianity equals the Western world. It does not. Christianity did not originate in the Western world, and it is not the Western world. And in fact, it was opposite the Western world for the longest time. Did they use it to justify their claims? Yes. But people use everything to justify their claims. The same way that today we have all kinds of movements that try to use nature, and they try to use nurture, and they try to use schools and everything in the world to justify their claims. The way they did that was to omit parts that contradict them. Omitting a part of your scripture is not the same as the scripture itself allowing something to happen. The next one is the fact that people have been scammed in churches. Well, believe it or not, but there is no place on this earth that you can go and not get scammed. I don't care what you do and where you do it, there's scammers waiting everywhere. All places have scammers. But if you say, I got scammed in this religion, therefore I'm abandoning the religion, you're not abandoning the religion, you're giving it up to the scammers. And so the only people left, if all the good people abandon religion, then who is left holding the religion at the end of the day? Nothing but the scammers. His last point is that Christianity has been a tool to oppress black people all over the world for, a long time, and therefore they should abandon it. And he says the people in Christianity, even though this oppression happened, something like 70 something percent of the population in America are still Christian. Well, let's think about this for a second. Is there a problem with that statement? It's very simple. It's the mirror of that. Christianity has played a big role in the oppression of anybody, really. Forget black people around the world. In Europe, it held them back. In the Islamic world, not the Islamic world, the Middle East, and in Africa, it had its negatives and positives. But the positives is what's missing from this conversation. Where are the positives about what Christianity has done in making people hold the ground, keep the faith when times were hard? Where's the part about the charity and the willingness of Christians to share positivity when nothing else would ever make them do that, where they thought it was their Christian duty? And I'm not just talking about one place. Ethiopia, the place I was talking about, was once searched by Europeans for Prester John. Prester John being a Christian saint, which they thought was going to help them against the Muslims. This is the part that's missing from this history, that Africa does not have a 100% negative history with Christianity, and then America does not either. It is only through the lens of Western control that we are looking at this, and I don't think that's fair.
And while we're at it, I actually think there's a more pressing, more existential question that needs an answer. Does God hate black people? In nearly every country on every continent around the world, darker-skinned people are treated poorly. By nearly every measurable standard, so-called black people are at the bottom of the social hierarchy everywhere.
You mean, of course, except all of the countries where they're not treated like the lowest. Places like several countries in Africa where the people who run the country are black and the people who are the richest in the countries are black. There might be oppression in the sense, or there might be financial disparity, and there might be all kinds of poor people in those countries, but those people are not the entire country. Places like Ethiopia, for example, have controlled their own version of Christianity for well over 1,000 years. To tell the Ethiopians that Christianity has been nothing but oppressive to them would be probably the dumbest thing on earth. Now, I'm not calling this person dumb. I'm just saying that it is not true that Christianity has just put everybody down. And in fact, Christianity in the beginning seemed to be highly in the favor of the black people. For example, Abraha, the Ethiopian, took over Yemen, and this brand of Christianity affected Islam, another religion which would be highly influenced by black people.
So much so that in majority black countries like Haiti and Nigeria, skin lightening creams are wildly popular. Anything to gain some proximity to whiteness and some distance from blackness.
And that's the fault of Christianity. How exactly? Contrary to popular belief, the Bible has many, many verses that are anti-discrimination against people of darker skin. In fact, here's one. Miriam and Aaron oppose Moses. This is a story of how Moses marries a Cushite, which is a Sudanese African. In some versions, she's called Negri, in other words, just black. And these two people, they oppose it because of the dark skin. God turns their skin as if it's been put in a furnace. So he makes them look like they're burned. And then they come back to their senses and God heals them because Moses asked them to. Then there's another part in the Bible where it says that Ethiopians, can't change their skin just like a leopard and all this other stuff. There's all kinds of stuff in the Bible that is pro black. The idea that the Bible is some kind of racist book is ridiculous. This is just an attempt to fuse atheism with anti-Westernism, I guess, which I'm part of.
Africa is rich with natural resources, boundless human potential, unfathomable wisdom, and brilliant cultural traditions. And yet, colonial powers have pillaged, exploited, and divided nations and people in ways that are frankly irreparable, all without consequence. I mean, I don't know.
Less to do with Christianity and more to do with greed, which is one of the things that Christianity rails against.
Think that God would help us out a little bit. We've been through a lot, God. Maybe there's a Bible verse that we can look to. And the Lord will make you the head and not the tail. You shall be above only and not be beneath. Who is this verse about? Not only do Black people identify as Christians at a higher rate, half of Black Americans report attending church at least once a week. I was one of them. In fact, I was a pastor for a number of years. I've preached all over the country and world. I've given Bible studies. I've baptized folks. I have been in it, and these questions have been nagging me for a while. So in this video, we're going to get some answers. I talked to a couple of people. One of them...
Were you one of those pastors that you were talking about in the beginning? The real question, though, that I have is, if you were part of the religion, did you really get nothing good out of it? Is that really what happened?
Is my friend Claudia.
My name is Claudia Allen.
She is easily one of the most conscious people I know. She's well-read, tapped into history and literature, a person who is thinking about race, class, and power in very critical ways. But she's also a Christian, a preacher, and a committed member of her church.
There is no other people group on the face of the planet who has experienced the kind of suffering that is akin to the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ like Black and brown people. No other group.
Since she is
I would add to that no amount of suffering compares in history to that has been suffered by some of the Black Africans, as there was a two-pronged approach which took out Black Africans from the side facing the Middle East and Black Africans from the side facing the Americas, and of course Europe. Especially if you consider the fact that Black Africans have hardly affected other groups outside of their own country in any way. I mean, if we think about it, how many massacres of people outside of Africa have been committed by people from Africa? No one ever talks about that.
Aware of what's happening in the world, I wanted to hear her reasons for keeping the faith. But I also spoke to Dr. Anthony B. Penn.
Well, my birth name is Anthony Bernard Penn, but most folks over the course of my life called me Tony.
He's a religious scholar, former pastor just like me, and now an atheist. And I think his perspective is important in this conversation.
Where is the historical evidence to support the claim that God is on the side of the oppressed?
Well, I hate to sort of throw this type of evidence out here, but since he asked for it, I mean, what about the abolition of slavery? What about decolonization? What about people, the 21st century is proof that there is some tilt away from oppressing people. I mean, the nightmare that was the past is slowly going away. Now, again, I don't see it as actual evidence, but if you frame it in that way, then that's the answer.
Right? What is the historical evidence that suggests God is on the side of black folks in North America working on their behalf? Because every moment of progress has been countered.
And if you stick around at the end,
I think Christians would argue that there's a malevolent force, whether it's the dragon, the beast, Satan, whoever you want. They would argue that there's a darker force working, and if you give up hope, then that force will completely consume the earth. But, I'm not here to defend it in this way again.
and I'll share how I'm thinking about my faith today. So let's dig in. I first encountered Dr. Penn's work when I was in seminary. I couldn't find the exact article that I read way back when, but it essentially argued that there is no God. But if there was a God, he clearly hated black people.
See, this is why I answered that question in that way, because clearly I could see that he's saying if there was a God. Now, I mean, I could argue so many things that are positive about being black, and also the problematicness of sort of framing the world as if black people are nothing but oppression. If you think about the good things that the black people in America have brought to the earth, and the populations in America that are still there right now that contribute heavily to that society and is highly valued by several different people in America, from markets to spiritual places to children to whatever. It's a very tight framing to just frame black people as oppressed. And I agree there is, a supremacy, but white supremacy doesn't explain black people. It explains oppressors. There is a phrase in Christianity that says count your blessings, and I think that this video could use a bit of that, a touch of that sentiment.
God hate black people? I mean, I think that's an important question, a question that too many black theists have ignored. Right? If you look at our experience, it is overwhelmingly tied to suffering. And true, all folks suffer, but this is disproportionate and unto death. And it ought to force us to raise the question: if God is loving, kind, just, and compassionate, and concerned with folks and can make stuff happen, and black folks still suffer disproportionately, then maybe that God doesn't like black people.
Or it's a sign that people have free will and they use their free will to oppress others, and some people get oppressed harder than others. But again, this is completely ignoring the fact that there are plenty of black people, both in America and around the world, who are living pretty prosperous lives and are not living in a realm of constant oppression. And obviously there's still white supremacy and they're affected negatively, and there is some negative to that, but to lay that at the hand of God. Also, I want to say, as an argument, would you then say, if black people were not oppressed, that is proof of God? And would you then say, this is where it gets really bad, because white people have seemed to be the least oppressed in the world today, that the white God is in favor? Like, there's proof now that the white God loves them. This is the problem with this argument. It takes away responsibility from the humans, and then it doesn't make any sense, to be honest.
Because white folks in general, right, as a group, seem to be doing all right. Black folks as a whole, not doing so well. And forget about the kind of misery that black women face. Or black trans folks. Forget about that kind of misery. Just in general, there is an overwhelming experience of misery. And again, if God is loving, kind, just, compassionate, concerned with folks and can make stuff happen, and black folks are disproportionately suffering, then maybe God doesn't like black folks.
Well, since we're already in the realm of what if, let's play the what if game of oppression, but let's do it with Jesus himself. So when Jesus was being nailed to the cross and he was being tortured and people were saying all kinds of things, at that very moment he could have said, "Where is God?" Right? And he said something similar to that. I don't remember what it was. But timeline wise, it's not over yet, is it? Black people are still around. The future is long. Things can still change. And in fact, black Christians could completely overturn the future if we try hard enough.
It's a question that's got to be wrestled with. And black Christians in particular haven't wrestled with it because they read the Bible assuming they are the favored community.
Well, I would argue if you keep the faith in all the suffering that you point out, that you should be the favored community, right? It means that your faith is so strong that no back-breaking, strength-taking, land-ripping human can totally destroy your faith. It's kind of a story of triumph.
They are the equivalent of the children of Israel. But if you look at our experience in the context of North America, you can make a reasonable argument, perhaps a more reasonable argument, that we are the Canaanites, the Moabites, the Hittites, the folks who get a whooping.
Well, the interesting thing about Christianity is all that sort of the chosen people and all of that sort of disappears. And God seems to represent every single person in the world, whether they got a whooping or not.
Right. So it seems to me that is a question that is central, that has to be wrestled with, but black theists have ignored it.
On the other hand, Christians like Claudia would argue that Dr. Penn is wrong and that the life of Jesus is proof that he is wrong.
The reason I would say there is a case for Christ as black, as resin, and not necessarily racially, gotta be clear, not necessarily racially black.
Even though it is possible that if he existed, he was racially black.
But experientially black. And that case is that this God put on human flesh, and when he was born in the midst of a genocide, flees to Egypt with his parents as a refugee seeking asylum, to then grow up in a working class community of Nazareth, black and brown people who were had no socioeconomic wealth or political position or station. And this brown man who hid in Egypt literally goes about the Gaza Strip teaching brown people about Creator God. He was disrupting the cultural system of not speaking to women. He disrupted the cultural system of not engaging with the unlearned. He touched the lepers. He healed the sick. And then because he did all of those things, he is falsely accused and he's arrested in the middle of the night. And we just got out of Easter weekend, right? They take him. All right. And he's literally before the Sanhedrin. They are desperately trying to pin him for a crime he did not commit. He dies in the middle of two criminals with the greatest, grossest execution known to human history. There is no other people group on the face of the planet who has experienced the kind of suffering that is akin to the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ like black and brown people. No other group in human history. And what is fascinating about that to me, Garrison, is that Black and brown people make up 80% of humanity on the globe. A very small minority group is currently experiencing global power.
Well, let me jump in a little bit because I thought she was going to go in another way. What's more impressive than the fact that we are binded by suffering, and I'll speak specifically for Black people around the world, Black, not brown, but Black people around the world, is that they fully endured the whole time, and still Africa and Black Americans still hold to the religion, meaning that it didn't break them. Think about it. Europeans gave them their best shot. They broke some other populations around the world almost to a full eradication, but Black people are still huge in numbers and growing.
Their lived experience is not that of a crucified Savior. It is that of a Roman and religious power. That is why we can say, like James Cone, that Jesus was Black.
To push back on that a little bit, the idea that suffering is Black is a dangerous concept a little bit, because it sort of puts us in the position where we think all Black people's existence was just suffering. And we know that Africa, people always say this all the time around America, Black people sold each other into slavery. But then they never mention that if you sell people into slavery, as some Black people did, you probably are gonna have a society behind that. Those Black people who sold other Black people into slavery, what was the reward at the end of the day? It means that there were some Black powers that were fully dominated. Also, I mean, this goes completely historically. Let's talk about Nubia, Ethiopia, the Swahili kingdoms, Central African kingdoms, Congo, places like Carthage that had large numbers of Black people, Yemen, and how the Christians, Black Christians, took over those regions. The idea that suffering is Black is it's a tough sell, to be honest.
Grew up in the West End of Atlanta, which means that for as long as I can remember, I've heard Hebrew Israelites and Five Percenters and folks in the Nation of Islam describe Christianity as the white man's religion.
I mean, arguably the Western brand of it is, because they select things that work for the West.
Idea that Black Christians were essentially worshiping the God of their oppressor. And Claudia had something to say about the history of Christianity in Black or African possession.
I think everyone knows that Ethiopia has always been a Christian nation.
And it's never been fully colonized. And it's colonized some people in the Middle East. And it was a source for refuge. It was a source for holding people who were Christian running away from the Middle East when the Muslims came after them. It was also a source for holding Muslims when other Muslims came after those Muslims. And it was a source for Egyptians who were running away from Egypt when there was oppression in those regions. And it's a holder of some of the oldest Christian artifacts. And it's a place for pride for Black people around the world. And it's one of the most decorative and most stylish places in Christian history. And Europeans, for the better part of 500 years, thought that the savior of Western Christianity was a man located in Ethiopia named Prester John. With that context, suffering seems to fade away as the only concept that sums up Black Christians.
But Ethiopia also was at this really important intersection of international trade. We get Ethiopia as this Christian nation because they had constant contact with the direct disciples of Jesus Christ, who were eyewitnesses to his life, death, and resurrection. But then even outside of Ethiopia, even if we go to Ghana with the Akan people, who also had their own creation narrative that is very similar to the creation narrative of the Hebrew scriptures, where they even named the creator God, the God of Saturday, right? So,
or another one in the Kingdom of Congo, Antonianism, which was a type of Christianity in the 1700s that was speaking against the Portuguese, and they had successfully, for the most part, gotten rid of a lot of Portuguese, and they based themselves in San Salvador, which used to belong to the Portuguese. It was spearheaded by two women. The first woman died, and then the second woman who carried it on was Kimpavita, a female who inspired the concept that all the deities of Christianity, or all the prophets, I mean, I call them deities because something else, but all the prophets of Christianity were literally from Africa. And that concept carried on for a long time. And even if you go to Congo today and some parts of that ancient Congo kingdom, you can still find Black representation on their presentation of the Christians. So even though it got in there in a very, very friendly way, to be honest, in the Kingdom of Congo, and even though it signified oppression for the people that were enslaved from the Kingdom of Congo, it really was a sign of hope and a push away from an oppressive group in the Kingdom of Congo. A story that is never told.
There has always been this very present belief in the Judeo-Christian God on the continent far prior to the Portuguese first coming to take slaves in 1471.
And while Christianity...
Not only was Christianity there way before the Portuguese landed up in that region, the people of Ethiopia were the first to have Christianity as their official state religion in the world. And then it was Rome, and then it was others. And of course, Christianity had spread throughout West Africa prior to the Europeans getting there. Now, in the Kingdom of Congo, Christianity came there through the Portuguese, but that's one location. And as I've shown you, they took a different take on it that was more African, and it didn't come with all the oppression that the other brand of Western influence did on other Africans, especially those located in Brazil.
He has been an incredibly powerful and positive force in the Black community, nurturing our most progressive and effective voices. It's impossible to ignore the most regressive elements present in the faith.
Well, from very early on, Black church figures tried to publicly reimagine the position of Black folks within the context of the United States, yeah? So one of my favorites is Henry McNeil Turner. Henry McNeil Turner in the late 1800s in Atlanta, Georgia, argued that God is a Negro. Pause. 1800s, Atlanta, Georgia, God is a Negro. He also argued that the flag of the United States is a dirty rag and will remain so until Black folks are treated properly. So you get these sorts of figures who are moving between the church and political life, right? He holds several appointments. Other ministers are moving into political office. And then you move through the decades and you get someone like Adam Clayton Powell Jr., right? So you get churches that are sure enough involved in the political process. And this was fruitful, one, because these churches were economically independent. So these ministers, by and large, could work for the well-being of Black folks without worrying about paychecks.
Which is one of the statements that I guess you provided that proves that God is not entirely on the side of the oppression of Black people if he exists, right?
The Black church was the first organization for and by Black folks. So the church becomes an easy mechanism Black folks could use to be involved. It gave them a theology that included them. They were made in the image of God. Yes, that Black folks had deep importance and significance, and provided them with opportunities to live that in public, both as individuals and as a collective. So the Black church has played that sort of role, but the Black church has played that role almost exclusively in relationship to race. So
that is another thing about the church, that it has the ability to organize. When you can have the entire community in one place, facing one agenda and being of one mind, you almost have no other concept in the world that is like that. Think about it. Where else on earth can you get the entire community to show up in one location for the same idea with no real dissenters, at least not any in any majority figure, understanding that they all came to assert that they are blessed and should live their lives in that way? Whether or not you believe in God, you must appreciate the power that lies behind that type of message. And again, to let it go to scammers and people like that would be pretty dangerous.
it hasn't dealt well with issues of gender and sexism. Forget about its ability to deal with sexuality. What happens to a trans population within Black churches, right? So they worked hard to try to get race right, but we are not one-dimensional beings, right?
Well, it's no surprise that a Black link of churches is concerned more with Blackness than they are with gender and everything else that's involved in that. That will probably need to be first looked by people who represent that type. And then once they do that, then we can come in once they have a cohesive and an idea that makes sense. You can't exactly take a church that wasn't designed for something and just reimagine it because you have certain political pushes that you want to push in a small amount of time.
We are not beings who are simply defined by anti-Blackness in terms of race. There are a variety of ways in which this society has tried to marginalize, if not kill us, and Black churches have been reluctant to address that. I think one of the shortcomings of Black churches, why they have not been willing to engage a much more expansive agenda, is because of respectability politics.
Oh no, a new word. What is respectability politics? I hope it means like you become a respectable person, which then I agree with that statement that it's important to be respectable.
If we look like white folks, if we sound like white folks, if we structure our individual and collective lives in ways that mimic white folks, they will have to appreciate us. So we've reached.
Well, I mean, considering the fact that Black fashions are in America have pretty much changed how America dresses for decades now, I don't think that concept holds up anymore. Maybe in the form of like a suit or something that was true, But today, I don't think black people consider themselves respectable if they look like white people. What I'm seeing is every other culture trying to look like black people.
It's the point again where black churches, the dominance of black churches is being consistently challenged by pointing out its shortcomings. And we also have new vocabulary, new grammar, new ways of naming our positions in the world that are enhanced and spread so very effectively through social media.
I appreciate everyone in this video. I think they did a good job, and I think everybody has got a valid and got very good opinion. I'm just offering a pushback. Now, my only problem with this part of the video is I have no idea what he's talking about.
So black folks know there are options. They know I'm a secular humanist and I'm not alone.
Why is that? Why are more black people identifying as atheist today? Why is that happening?
Because of the freedoms afforded to them in the United States that allows them to be that way, because of the many arguments that atheists have pushed around America, which again, believe what you want to believe. And thirdly, because the world itself is becoming more and more secular. So it's not a black people thing. Now, of course, focusing on black people is important, and to focus on why black people should look at Christianity with a certain bend like this is good. I'm not just criticizing the video. It's good to look at it in this bend, but also to remind yourself not to lose something that works for a silly idea like, if God is real, he hates black people.
Why are more black folks identifying as atheists today? I think what is happening is a greater degree of comfort with naming what they have been. Right? Black atheists and secular humanists didn't just pop on the scene recently.
That's a good point, and it goes to the first point that I said, that it's the freedoms afforded to you. In certain countries which are state run, the state is religious, a lot of people are way more afraid to say whether or not they believe in a separate, not even atheism, just a separate religion than the one that the state holds. So if you're afforded that freedom, you will partake. And I hope everything goes well.
We have existed, but we've reached a moment in history in which the dominance of the black church is being legitimately challenged, right? Legitimately challenged. And this has been more graphic over the past 3 decades with the spiritual but not religious. Right?
I feel like they've moved far away from the original framing of the video of whether or not God cares about black people. But let me address what he just said there. The spiritual but not religious. So in South Africa, in one of the census that were done a long time ago, when people asked what their religion was, a sizable portion of the population said God. Meaning that even though they worship the Christian God, they were not Christian in any denominational way, but instead they were just believed in God. This again goes completely against this idea that God is tied to the black church, or he's tied to the Western church, or he's tied to Ethiopian church, or any church, and to sort of put limitations on him and how you should look at him or whether or not he cares about black people is very narrow thinking. But here's a video that will sort of explain it in a different way.
But when you really look at actually, what do you really think about God? Forget your religion. What do you think about him, or her, the elements of what it is?
I don't think he's mad, and I don't think you get judged for what you did. Meet the Wizard.
Yeah, yeah, I like this.
Yeah, but don't you? But religion is inherently that too. There's this guy. He's watching you. He's hanging out.
No, but check this out. I know religion has its flaws. I'm with you 100%.
Okay.
But how do you think we would be without it? You think we would be better off? Really, you think? Imagine us thinking.
No, I don't think. I don't think you need to go all the way the other way when now there's no judgment and blah blah blah. The bullshit that I'm was at. I think that if there was a
No. Since you think it's so bad, just say, what do you think? It should be no religion.
no, I don't think that. I think
Or it
that
shouldn't be no Catholic religion.
no. It's like you're looking at an old house that needs to be redone. You don't need to tear it down. You just need to upgrade it.
What about spirituality, Mike? There's spirituality, your connection with God, without being in any one of these religions.
I don't know spirituality, but spirituality comes from religion pretty much.
It doesn't have to.
You know?
You know?
So you dictating your own show then. All these rules are my rules now. So I'm spirituality, so I'm pretty much a prophet or else I'm God. Since I'm going through a spiritual perspective, and it's my spiritual perspective, why don't I write a few lines in the book or something? Matter of fact, why don't I make up my own book?
People have made up their own book.
In that small clip, almost every single thing that is talked about in this video is addressed, and in some way it's addressed combatively but usefully. And that clip is about 5 minutes long, and I'm not going to play the whole thing. But basically they come to the conclusion that even if you're not religious, it's probably very important to live like you are.
Or those who claim no particular religious affiliation. The percentage of black folks who move in one of those two directions is noteworthy. The dominance of the black church has been fractured. In more recent years, I think some of that is a result of the ways in which Black Lives Matters, for example, has given us opportunity to rethink our engagement with the world and to rethink our meaning-making processes and to think Black life in ways that push against the ways in which Black churches have confined it. It's all.
I'm going to be honest again. I respect everybody in this video. I'm lost again.
Also the case that if you think in terms of hip hop, a major influence within the context of the United States, there has been a softening, a signifying, a rethinking of these dominant theistic themes. So Tupac is Black Jesus, the patron saint of thugs.
Well, that's a very one-dimensional take on Tupac. Tupac was a globalist mentally, and he definitely, even though we can, realize that he had some gang affiliation, ideals that he promoted within his music, it sort of falls in comparison to, first of all, his musical ability, and then secondly, towards his larger message. Most of the songs that I've ever heard of Tupac being played by anyone of any race, there's like Changes, Dear Mama, all these songs that have to do with helping people. And I think to just make him seem like he was like a thug, like, no. First of all, within the Black community, he's not just seen as a thug, but then within the entire world, some people in America have no idea how big Tupac is as a celebrity. And even though there was this East Coast, West Coast thing going on in America, it meant nothing to people outside of America. When most people around the world play Tupac's music, they don't think, I want to be a thug like Tupac. They think, how did that person make that type of music? And why did that person who died so young come across like a 50-year-old man? Wise in so many ways, yet youthful in so many others.
Or on Crown, Jay-Z says you're in the presence of a king. Scratch that, you're in the presence of a god. Or Kanye West says, I am a god. Right? So you get this kind of rethinking that has been in place for a while. Because the 5%ers, for example, argued we're getting this all wrong because the black man is God. This is where the Nation of Islam falls short for them. Nation of Islam says you're created in the image of Allah. 5%ers say, no, we are gods, right? So there has been a softening, a reworking, a rethinking of these categories for a good stretch of time.
Okay, so confession
Yeah. Well, I don't know.
time. I'm a Christian. You're probably not surprised by that. But I will say that I've gone
Well, the cross on your shirt kind of gave it away a little bit.
through a kind of deconstruction. I don't like that term. I think it's a bit overused, but these for me are shifts and evolutions in my faith that often leave me feeling uncomfortable with all of the assumptions and baggage present in calling myself a Christian. Most of that discomfort is because of the way Christians have chosen to represent themselves in politics over the last 20 to 30 years. Christian nationalism is a mind virus. It is a cancer in the church. Titles and nomenclature aside, here's why I still resonate with the Christian faith. I have 3 reasons. First, Christianity is a Middle Eastern, or more accurately, a Near Eastern religion, which means it should be rightly understood within an Eastern framework. For me, in order to give Christianity a fair shake, I have to understand it separately from the bastardized version we know today.
Good man. See, that's exactly how it works. You have to separate it because it is not Western in origin. And if you take it as a Western religion, you will hate it.
I'll come back to that in my 3rd point. The cultural context of the Bible's authors and main characters would not align with the money-hungry capitalistic structures we know today. This means that success in the biblical narrative exists almost exclusively outside of the confines of worldly possession or wealth accumulation. Our top-down preconception about who is favored and who isn't simply do not fit within the framework of the biblical narrative.
I completely agree. And in fact, after reading the Gospels hundreds of times, okay, maybe not hundreds, but many times, I can say that the one thing that the Gospels rail against, or they go against over and over and over and over, is greed, more than anything else, which is one of those things that in the Western world is not looked at as a bad thing. Constant accumulation, constant wealth, never giving back to the lower, but instead holding it. I mean, let's take that one quote by Jesus. It's easier for a camel to walk through the eye of a needle than for a rich person to end up in heaven. Now remember, the context of that was that a poor person is willing to give up all their money for a blessing, while a rich person is not even willing to give up 1% of his money. Somehow, having wealth itself makes you greedy. And this is what is meant by the love of money is the root to all evil, because somehow it consumes you and it becomes about holding it forever. Some people put their entire life on hold, making enemies of the people around them in order to get money, and not realizing that there is more to life than just wealth. You've completely isolated yourself, and when it's all said and done, you can't take it with you. The only people who will be here to talk about you are the people whose relationships you have built. But if you have built none, and all you have done is step on anyone to get ahead, then that greed has consumed your life, and it will consume your name in death. But for some reason, most churches focus on, like, even though I don't care, they focus on things like sexuality, blah, 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 this and that, and stuff that probably would be considered very low on the spectrum of sins. Though, if you're Christian, you're called to go against whatever the Bible tells you to. So
In fact, the ultimate main character of the book, Jesus, was a Middle Eastern Jewish man who was born in a barn, lived as a nomad, owned no earthly possessions, believed in sweeping debt forgiveness, and constantly criticized the exploitative practices of businessmen, church grifters, and oppressive governments.
I know that a lot of Americans are probably not going to understand this, but of everything else he said, I agree that he was oppressed. But being Middle Eastern in the Middle East back in the day was not a sign of oppression. Being Jewish, probably, being so many other tribes there, sure. But Middle Eastern powers were in power back in the day, and they controlled a hell of a lot. They were not just victims of oppression, they were the oppression.
And this is connected. I've read the book. Slave owners frequently cut out critical parts of the biblical narrative to stop black people from learning the whole story. Books like the Exodus were removed from slave Bibles because those stories were too radicalizing for the enslaved to have access to. This is one of the great ironies of the anti-black book bans taking place across the country. They're acting just like their grandfathers who thought they could ban radicalizing books from the Bible. Slave preachers were brought onto
There's other books that have nothing to do with black people. Well, not in the American sense of black people from the Bible that were removed by the Romans, which still exist in the Ethiopian version of Christianity. So it's not just a thing where, I mean, I know some people who only have the New Testament and that's their Bible. So even though I understand, I also understand that it is a selection process anyway.
plantations to preach about how the Bible commands the enslaved to obey their masters. That's Ephesians chapter 6. But they were not allowed to preach verses in the book just before, Galatians chapter 3, which says that the slave and the free are made equals in Christ Jesus. When you read the book, the whole book, it is clear that God is squarely on the side of the oppressed and decidedly against the oppressor, even when the oppressors are his people.
At this point, he's saying nothing but facts, and I can say that for every thing that seems strange in the Bible, there's always a counter, which some atheists read as a contradiction, while some Christians read as a rectifying point, one that directs people. So when something says, go and, kill these type of people, and then you go to another part of the Bible and says, thou shalt not kill, that is not a contradiction, but instead, what is the punishment for murder? The punishment for murder is death. When he tells them to go kill those people, it's because he interprets a lot of them as murderers.
More on that in a bit. I've read the New Testament, like the book of Luke, where Jesus says that his singular mission is to bring liberation to the oppressed. Jesus goes on to present a powerfully progressive vision of something close to universal health care, debt forgiveness, and a kind of criminal justice reform. The third reason why I still identify as a Christian is a bit more logical and directly connected to reading the book. The Bible presents a narrative of people doing what they want to do, often in direct opposition to what the God of Scripture tells them to do. One could argue that one of the central themes of the Bible is choice and how the divine is navigating people's freedom to choose. From Adam and Eve choosing to eat the forbidden fruit of the garden, to David choosing to step up and fight Goliath, to some people choosing to accept or reject Jesus as the Messiah. Choice is woven throughout the text, and what comes with that choice is a great deal of risk. Human error, exploitation, and wrongdoing are often the fruit of that risk.
An important point, which goes against this idea that God should control you like a toy and you should have no consequences and have no choice. And that would be good. But by what measure would that be good for you to be controlled like a slave and have no will or understanding of your own?
This is, for me, where faith has its limits, because we all have choices to make. If I choose to harm someone, it doesn't matter how many Bible verses I quote. I will be responsible for my actions. It would be silly for me to place the blame for my actions on God. Similarly, hundreds of years of Europe and the West's nonstop colonial exploitation of African people and land is a choice that has produced far-reaching outcomes to this day. I would challenge you to go back and read the writings of white people living in what would become America in the 1600s and the 1700s. They knew what they were doing. America's enslavement.
Not only did they know what they were doing, but there were other people who actively spoke up against what they were doing at the time. And a lot of people don't know this because, of course, if you narrow the world, especially the world at that time, which was global, to one place, then you won't understand that there's a wider world that needs to be spoken about here. And there were some people who were stationed in the Kingdom of Congo who said, this is the most religious place I've ever seen, and enslaving the people here is just wrong. And that's a long time ago, 1600s. But this has nothing to do with everything else.
Segregation, mass incarceration, and continued exclusion of Black people is a choice. And if God exists, I don't think it's fair to blame that on them. Anti-Blackness is real, and it isn't of God's making. The Bible basically describes Jesus as a Black person.
In the Bible, is Jesus, is his appearance in the Bible?
I believe they describe him with like
feet were bronze and hair was, yeah.
His feet was black as brass and his hair was that of wool. James Harden? James Harden? LeBron? You, what?
In some ways, I think this is why Black people are still Christians. The Bible promises a better tomorrow despite the trials of today.
Damn, I nailed it right on the dot. See, because remember the part where I said, talking about the oppression of Black people as if all Black people's lives are over and it can't get any better is incorrect. See, if it gets better from now on, which is going to be a fusion of, if you're a believer, God, and personal responsibility, trying to get yourself out of a mess. What's that old saying? The best thing you can do for the impoverished is to not become one of them.
And you may scoff at the therapeutic nature of that claim, and I get it. But there's also something powerful about hope. And the Black church, despite all of its flaws, has harnessed that hope, producing art, expression, and movements that have changed the world.
A beautiful ending, and the only thing I could say is the only consequence of that is that the other religions didn't get to play a large role in influencing because of such dominance. But that's good. Any and everything that we see today, whether it be hip hop or anything like that, was first influenced by the early spiritual songs that were made in the Americas and also in Africa that spread, and then they start to become secular, but still in the tradition or in the ways that a lot of those religious songs were. But you know, music is only a small part of how it affected us. Politics springs out of religion. Organization springs out of religion. Almost everything you see around you, real life, not art, came out of religion. You know how I know? Because religion was the only game that was playing that at some point. Everything else was just a practice. Now let me state my opinion real quick. It doesn't matter whether or not you're a Christian. You must agree that it is very difficult in a secular world where everyone is secular to come together and tell people and prove to people that they all need to get together, even if something is real. Think of anything from exploration in space to global warming to political change to removing oppression to freeing the sick to whether or not you should care about the poor. Only religion is one track minded on that. But in politics, you get all kinds of opinions that are like maybe the poor should just not exist. Some people say they like the spiritual side of religion, but the religious side of religion is actually the one that makes all of the efforts in real life.